Donkey Kong Country is the first game I ever played on the Game Boy Advance. The series began on the SNES as a reboot of the Donkey Kong franchise, but I only ever got to experience the Game Boy Advance version, so I will use the GBA version as my point of reference. As you can surmise, this is a side-scrolling platform game that I consider to be the GBA, the greatest platformer of all time. Yeah, that's crazy for a number of reasons because there are plenty of platformers with better gameplay, story, art, and all that bullshit. But you are welcome to have your own GBAs, as the GBA is individually based. So why is it my GBA? Let's start by talking about the mental components of nostalgia. At least how I rationalize and assess the feeling of nostalgia. It's kind of much more difficult than you think to capture fully a feeling that can be so fleeting for many, but can also hold people for years, which I will briefly talk about later. I can break down the feeling of nostalgia by describing what draws me to the feeling. If there is a universal component to nostalgia, I think it lies in the very definition of the word, which is a sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. There is an obvious emotional connection with these games, which is the very reason we feel it, so that would be the main part we can all associate with. Once this feeling has been reached, we need to ask ourselves if we should engage with it or not. This process can be pretty mentally draining for me because it often results in an ethical battle in my head. I often ask questions like, am I only feeling this way because I actually love the game, or because I just want to distract myself from my responsibilities? Specifically with Donkey Kong Country, it was always more than just misusing an intimate feeling. I wanted to engage with it so I could study my own nostalgia, and so I could rekindle a youthful passion I had for these games. When I choose to engage with the feeling, sometimes this means just playing the game through in my spare time, or in this case, writing an essay and deeply exploring it. It'll obviously be different on an individual basis, but this is to say that most gamers can find true benefit from engaging with nostalgia. I can't think of a better grounding exercise than turning on a familiar game for the first time in a while. It's also just beneficial for general pleasure, which isn't inherently wrong. Once you engage with the feeling, then you see the game again. I emphasize the word see because it's the first thing that you do before you play it, which are two different processes. Sometimes you'll start up the retro game you've been itching to play, and then the eye test fails you. I can't even count the times I started a game hoping to capture a similar experience of old, and then just simply seeing the game turns the feeling away. I would not classify this as nostalgia. More so, I would say this is me mistaking pleasure for nostalgia, or at least seeking pleasure. Generally, if the game passes the eye test, then the subsequent sound and gameplay tests, it's usually true nostalgia, the feeling that you deeply want to fulfill that emotional connection you have with the game. So this is how I rationalize and quantify nostalgia. Now I'm going to describe those components specifically in Donkey Kong Country. The first component is the color of the game. I remember falling in love with these rich backdrops that perfectly cohered with the gameplay. A skillful intermingling of 2D landscapes with textured pastel models that act as interactive platforms. As a child playing this, my imagination could only survive. At the time, there was no room for this post-childhood analysis I'm doing right now. The colors of the game accentuated the stunning graphics produced both by the SNES and the GBA. Both consoles are rather comparable in terms of art style and overall graphical capabilities of the game. However, the SNES version did provide dynamic levels in terms of weather and lighting being more prominent, and the backgrounds are a bit more lively, which is a nice touch. Every element in the game had its own distinct color: the shiny yellow of the bananas, the muted black and gold letterstones, the barrels with their textured brown wood, the drooping verdant leaves on the platform palm leaves, the life balloons that come in brown and RGB look like clay moldings of Donkey Kong's face, the glimmering gold bonus trophies that allow us to get a shit ton of lives. Every enemy has their own unique shade and color scheme as well. Even the level warps, which appropriately casts the image of a cosmic glacial space and time portal. And there are many more. These are things we generally don't think about in passing. We just classify them as pieces of the game rather than artistic components, because that's the nature of playing a game. All of these beautifully variegated components are accompanied by their sound effects and also the game's soundtrack, which was produced by a man named David Weiss with the help of Evelyn Fisher and Robin Beanland. Let's take one unique visual aesthetic and layer on a distinct sonic aesthetic, which is what makes the journey from start to finish feel like adventure rather than simple traveling. In the beginning levels, we are introduced to some insouciant xylophonic melodies, carried by the happy beats of bongos. Toward the middle of the game, the sound begins to spelunk, and not just because of all the caves. The aquatic ambiance of the water level songs brought on by the somber use of a keyboard and synthesizer gave me the feeling of being led through an ethereal aqueous world by some sort of godly swordfish. As we move up the island mountain, we start to feel our journey become more perilous when we hear fast keys and alarming synth sounds acknowledging the dangers of apes trying to climb an icy terrain. As we move on to the more industrial levels away from nature, the songs become more technical, matching a kind of old uncanny sound that is equal parts in tune and off-kilter based on the environment we are currently in and just came from respectively. David Weiss knew exactly how to make a sound play in a specific environment. The sound matches the environment perfectly every time, ensuring that gamers experience full sensory pleasure. The next bit I want to share is fully anecdotal and not at all analytical, but it's meant to express how personally the music affected me as a kid and overall as a person. The very first time I listened to the Aquatic Ambience theme song, I remember playing the level like 5 times over just to hear it again. That night I dreamt an aquatic dream that started as a nightmare. I was being ripped apart by these predatory jellyfish that were perpetually shocking me until my skin tore to pieces. But then I started hearing that Aquatic Ambience song, and I was rematerialized by a water goddess that told me to drown in light and everything would be okay. This was the closest thing to a psychedelic experience I ever had without actually consuming anything with psychedelic properties. I'm not an expert on how music affects the brain, but I have a strange suspicion that there are just certain frequencies and vibrations that activate things within us, whether a subtle change in mood or a grandiose amphibious dream. The music in Donkey Kong Country, along with its sound effects, have the power to change things, and any good soundtrack will do the same. And this trend only gets better with its 2 sequels, as those soundtracks offer much more dynamic sounds and elaborate musical compositions. Now we need a purpose for all these components, and this is what makes these retro platformers unique. Donkey Kong Country built their story around their gameplay mechanics. The story begins in slight chaos as K. Rool's Kremlings steal the Kong's banana hoard. The Kongs, determined to get their bananas back, travel throughout their island jumping on heads and cartwheeling and somersaulting through guts until they reach K. Rool's ship and defeat him. Although the Kongs at the end break the 4th wall and basically set up their own sequel, which I think is exactly the kind of humor kids appreciated back in the day. I surely did. What's interesting to me about the story is if you boil it down, it's the simplest shit ever. One guy with an army robs a family and the family wants their shit back. That's it. The story is the simplest part about the whole game, but as always, there is room for theory and analysis, so let's do some. The one glaring image that comes up to me in this game is literally in the name of the thing K. Rool stole, the banana hoard. So this idea of having a hoard of wealth is the main driving force of the story. It's what calls our heroes to action, and it also gives our enemies purpose. This premise also fuels all of the gameplay simply because without it there would be no game. Another purpose that might fuel the game is simply the act of escapism, knowing that even 15 years later, this game could still act as a touchstone for me and other devout fans. One could say that because of its heavy arcade influences, that in itself is a purpose for moving the game forward. The act of seeing your scores, bananas, balloons, and items go up in number, and feeling some sort of quantitative accomplishment. And I'm not so sure that this feeling should be discounted, because it's a process that's more prevalent today than it was 15 years ago. What about the gamer's purpose? Shouldn't that fuel a game? Absolutely, and it does here more so than many games even today. It's incredibly rewarding to play this game if you're a gamer of many playstyles, especially someone who prides themselves on completing a platformer with the least amount of jumps, or taking the most efficient routes, or getting through without dying and things of that nature. It rewards a gamer stepping out of their comfort zone, but also reinforces the gamer that simply wants a point A to point B experience, and then everything in between. Again, this idea develops much more in its sequels. So let's end the video with a note of nostalgia. I talked about my sort of view on nostalgia, but there was another side of it I wanted to address. Nostalgia can be a daunting and insidious force that may hold you in one time period for so long, or with such an intense focus, that life passes you by without realizing it. I call this destructive nostalgia, and I know people have seen some version of this before. When a person only yearns for the old days, when they subscribe so devoutly to the myth of the golden age, so to speak, and disregard any of the circumstances of their present reality because they do not believe it is worth existing there. This doesn't seem to be a massive issue, but it happens, and from my personal experience with meeting different gamers, it seems to be a developing issue. Maybe the pandemic has made us long for times that were simpler and more enjoyable. Perhaps this is an issue that correlates with the rising amount of mental health issues. It's something worth thinking about and exploring. I will end off on a positive note. Nostalgia is also one of the most important feelings a human will ever experience. It has the power to produce a crossroads effect, so to speak, almost like guilt does. Although when you engage with nostalgia in a healthy and pleasurable way, you might find you will learn more about yourself and even that retro game that you thought you would have. Donkey Kong Country produced and still produces this feeling with most, but I have my suspicions it's because it's one of the greatest series ever developed,